Good morning. Welcome to our Friday morning theology readers breakfast here at Greenbelt Baptist Church. Hopefully you've got your breakfast, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and maybe you've gotten The Mortification of Sin by John Owen. It's great to have this and read along if you do have it. And we've been working through this now for the past 6 weeks or so, 5 weeks. And it's a book which is helping us think through Paul's command in Romans 8, verse 14, that if we by the Spirit put to death the deeds of the flesh, then we will surely live. We are working now through chapter 6, where John Owen asks the question, what is mortification? We saw last week what mortification is not, and now we want to here in chapter 6 ask what mortification is. What is the positive definition of mortification? What does it actually look like? Well, without further ado, chapter 6, John Owen, the mortification of sin. What mortification is? The mortification of lust consists in three things. First, a habitual weakening of sin. A habitual weakening of sin. Every lust is a depraved habit or inclination pushing the heart toward evil. Genesis 6:5. Genesis 6:5 describes the man who has not mortified his lust. Every imagination of the thoughts of his heart is only evil continually. This man is always under the power of a strong bent and inclination toward sin. The reason that the natural man does not always pursue a single lust night and day is because he has so many different lusts to serve. Each one of his lusts is crying out to be satisfied. So again, for those just chiming in, we're looking at chapter 6. What is mortification? What is it? And he's describing here, at least in the first paragraph, that mortification is a habitual weakening of the lust, but he's reminding us that sin, temptation, lust within the heart is something that is bringing the whole man in a strong inclination toward evil and sin. And that we serve many lusts, not just one, that there's constant temptations floating about and bubbling up within our hearts. He goes on to say, even though a lust is not always exerting an influence on our imagination and thoughts, we should consider that lust that we seek to mortify, a strong and deeply rooted habitual inclination and bent of the will and affections. So even though it's not always apparent that we're in the midst of some kind of temptation, nonetheless, we should always be thinking, what sin is going to get me? What sin is there? I might not be feeling the power of it right now. I might be in the heat of the moment. Nonetheless, I know it's there, and I ought to be giving my attention and my mind toward that sin. And that's a part of mortification. Men are said to have their hearts set upon evil, and the inclination in their spirit is to make provision for the flesh. Romans 13:14. Our moral and holy habits exert themselves differently from lust. Moral habits speak to the soul gently and appropriately as they should. Sinful and depraved habits arrive with violence and impetuousness. These lusts are said to fight or wage war against the soul. 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 11. They rebel and rise up, demanding our fulfillment in them. See Romans 7:23, in which sin is said to take a man captive to accomplish its goal. From the description we have in Romans 7, lust darkens the mind, extinguishes convictions, dethrones reason, interrupts the power and influences that resist it, and then breaks out into an open flame. some important distinctions to be made about the nature of lust. So what should we know about the nature of lust? Well, one lust in a man may prove to be much stronger than another lust might be in that same man. Or a particular lust might also be stronger in one man than in another man. Certain lusts and temptations may be strengthened by the natural constitutions and temperaments of particular persons. So I was just thinking about this earlier this morning. There is one man who might have a temptation toward drunkenness, and yet that same temptation in another man who has a history in his family of drunkenness will experience that temptation far more. One man who has a strong temptation toward drinking too much might be able to fight against that temptation, even though it's strong, in a more successful way than somebody who grew up in a household who had no pattern or set example of fighting against that at all. Or I'm reminded of an example that Tim Keller gives in his excellent book, The Reason for God, where he says, think of a man born in England in the 800s who has a proclivity to fight and get angry really easily, but he also has a proclivity to be attracted to other men. So here's a man in England in the year 800 AD, and he wants to fight everybody, and he wants to go into battle, but he also has a proclivity to be attracted to other men. Which proclivity is that man in the year 800 more prone to exalt as good, and the other one, is he more prone to say, I'm not going to give in to that? The man in England in the year 800 is more prone to exalt his ability to fight as something that's really good, and his anger and his brutality is something to be cherished because he wants to be a strong warrior, and in that society, that's something that's valued and upheld. Whereas his proclivity to be attracted to other men is not something that's going to be given into, because he knows in that society that it's also valued to have a family and have children and to raise sons who can also fight and do battle. But take that same man and put him in Manhattan in the year 2020 and ask the question, what is he more likely to value and what is he more likely to not value and put down? He's more likely in 2020 to value his proclivity to be attracted to other men just because society in that moment exalts that as something, whereas he will see his proclivity to be angry and to fight everyone as an anger issue, because Manhattan culture and society at this time doesn't see fighting everybody as something good. You take the same man, and both proclivities can be and are sinful, and yet one man in one society fights it differently than the same man in a different society. I think that's something that John Owen is kind of bringing out here. He says also, opportunity inflames the strength of a lust. Satan has thousands of ways to support a lust so that it grows violent and impetuous above other lusts. The strength of the lust darkens the mind so that the knowledge that one might have resisted exerts no power over the will, so that the lust finds freedom to express itself. In particular, lust gets its strength by temptation. When a suitable temptation falls in line with a lust, the lust obtains a new life, a new vigor and power, and violence and rage that it did not seem capable of before. Some lusts are more obvious than others and more serious in their outcome. Paul distinguishes sexual immorality from other sins. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18. Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. Other sins, perhaps, such as the love of the world, may be just as strong and predominant in a man, but they do not do as much damage to the whole man. With this in mind, a particular man may appear in comparison with others to be a mortified man. In reality, however, his lust is just as strong, though maybe not as apparent. His lust may not be as outwardly scandalous as others, but it is lust just the same. It may not disturb the soul as violently as others, but it nevertheless controls him as he secretly harbors it within him. Well, what about the weakening of lust? What about the weakening of lust? The first thing in mortification is the weakening of the habit of sin or lust, so that it shall not with that violence, earnestness, and frequency rise up and conceive, provoke, entice, and disquiet as it naturally has a tendency to do. James 1, 14 through 15. This is called crucifying the flesh with its passions and desires, or so says Paul in Galatians 5:24. We seek to take away that about it which gives it its strength and power. We aim at the killing of the body of death day by day, says Paul in 2 Corinthians 4:16. So, when a man is nailed to a cross, he at first struggles and strives and cries out with great strength and might. But as his blood and his spirit wastes away, his strivings become faint and seldom. His cries grow low and hoarse, and they're scarcely to be heard. So when a man first determines to conquer a lust or a sin and to deal with it in earnest, the sin struggles with great violence to break loose. It cries with earnestness and impatience to be satisfied and relieved. But by mortification, the blood and the spirits of it are let out. It moves seldom and faintly, cries sparingly, and it scarcely is heard in the heart. It may sometimes have a dying pang that makes an appearance of great vigor and strength, but it is quickly over, especially if it is kept from considerable success. What a great reminder when we're fighting against sin, that when we begin the activity of mortifying the deeds of the flesh, when we start going against that temptation with our heart, just expect it to cry out and fight back and to put as much energy into you being overcome by it, just as you're trying to overcome it. And yet be encouraged that the more you keep at it, the more it will die. Sin is like that thief on the cross, and he will do everything he can to be from being crucified. But once you crucify him, he will die. This Paul describes in Romans 6. Sin, he says, is crucified. It is fastened to the cross. To what end? Well, Paul says that the body of sin might be brought to nothing. The power of sin is weakened and abolished little by little, so that we should no longer be enslaved to sin. That is, so that sin should not be our master and control us as it has before. This includes not only our fleshly desires, but those of the mind and the will, which are all in opposition to God. Do you have desires and wills and choices and habits that are clearly opposed to the will of God, opposed to what God says in the Bible? If you are not putting those to death and they control you, they're a master over you, then you are dead. You're spiritually dead. But if by the Spirit you're alive, you can actually go to war against them. With all troubling sin, no matter whether it encourages us to do evil or hinders us from doing good, the rule is the same, says John Owen. It must be mortified or it will arise again. A man may beat down the bitter fruit from an evil tree until he is weary, but while the root of the tree continues to abide in strength and vigor, the beating down of the present fruit will not hinder it from bearing more evil fruit. This is the folly of some men. They set themselves with all earnestness and diligence against the breaking out of lust, but they leave the principle and root untouched. They'll make little or no progress in this work of true mortification. So, our fighting sin cannot be like the man who doesn't want an apple tree in his backyard. So he goes out every spring and he knocks down the apples off of the branches. The tree's just going to bring out more apples again next year. To get the tree out of the garden, you've got to uproot it, and even more so with sin. And that takes work, that takes effort, but that's what John Owen is helping us to do. So 2, mortification of sin is a constant fight and contention against sin. It is a constant fight and a constant contention against sin. To be able to fight effectively against sin is a large part of sin's mortification. When sin is strong and vigorous, the soul finds it difficult to make headway against it. The inner man sighs, groans, mourns, and is troubled at its force. David complains that his sin had overtaken him so that he could not see. How little then was he able to fight against it? So 3 things are required in this fighting against sin. First, we need to recognize the enemy we're dealing with and resolve that it is to be destroyed by all means possible. The battle is a vigorous and hazardous one that deals with the issues of eternity. When a man is not very concerned, he sees his lust as a trivial thing. It is an indication that he is not mortified or even heading in that direction. So in other words, if you give in to sin and your heart isn't even troubled by it, there's no pang in your conscience. Your conscience isn't stirred, your heart isn't stricken with some kind of fear, well then you're not mortifying, and it doesn't even look like you're heading in the right direction. We cannot go forward, says Owen, unless we recognize the plague of our own hearts. It is to be feared that too many do not realize the enemy that they carry about within them. This makes them ready to justify themselves and to be impatient when they are reproved by others or admonished. They do not begin to realize the real danger that they're actually in. 2 Chronicles 16:10. So 2, we need to be intimately acquainted with the ways, the wiles, the methods, the advantages, and the occasions which give lust its success. This is how men deal with their enemies. They search out their enemies' plans and they ponder their goals and they consider how and by what means they have prevailed over them in the past. Then they can be defeated. Without this kind of strategic thinking, warfare is very primitive and not to be won successfully. Those who indeed mortify lust deal with it in this way. Even when lust is not enticing and seducing them, they consider still, while at leisure, there is still an enemy within me. This is his way and his methods. These are his advantages. This is the way he has prevailed, and he will do this if he is not prevented. One of the choicest and most important parts of spiritual wisdom is to find out the subtleties and the policies and the depths of any indwelling sin, to consider where its greatest strength lies, how that sin uses certain occasions and opportunities and temptations to gain an advantage over you. We need to find out its pleas and its pretenses and its subtle reasonings to get us to buy into it and see what its strategies and disguises and its excuses are. I was talking with a young man earlier this week who has been trying to fight, and it's great evidence that he wants to fight well against the temptation of lust. And so I asked him, when are you most prone to giving into lust? Is it during the day or is it at night? And lo and behold, it's at night. He's more alone and everyone's going to sleep. Do you have your phone with you or not with you? He has his phone with him when he's going through social media. And so we're figuring out what ways this guy is most prone to give in to the temptation of lust. And so when nighttime arises and everyone's getting ready to go to bed, that's when you start praying more. Are you putting your phone away? Give somebody your phone at night so you don't have it in the privacy of your own bedroom. Give it to your parents. Let your dad have your phone. And don't give it back to you until you wake up for breakfast the next morning. What strategies has sin used to get you to fall into its traps? And therefore, wisely figure it out so that you can wisely fight it. We need to set the spirit against the craft of the old man, to trace this serpent in all its turning and windings, and to bring its most secret tricks out into the open. We must learn, says Owen, to say this is your usual method, sin. I know what you're up to. And so we will always be ready if this is the beginning of our warfare. 3, we need to continue to attack our lusts daily with the spiritual weapons that are most detrimental to it. This is the key to warfare. Even when we think that a lust is dead because it's quiet, we must still labor to give it new wounds and new blows every day. Colossians chapter 3, verse 5. When the soul is in this condition and dealing in this way with lust, continually fighting against it, even when you don't feel sin there, then we have the upper hand and sin is under the sword and will begin to be dying. So 3, and lastly, what is mortification? Thirdly, it is a degree of success in the battle. Frequent success against any lust strengthens us and gives the evidence of mortification. Now, by success, I do not mean a mere disappointment of sin and that it is not put into practice. No, by success, I mean gaining full victory over it and pursuing it for a complete conquest. For instance, when the heart at any time recognizes sin and temptation in action, seducing it and forming sinful imaginations to put the lust into practice, at that moment, the heart must immediately see what's going on, bring the sin to the law of God and to the love of Christ, condemn it, and then still follow it to execute it to the uttermost. When a man comes to this state and condition, his lust is weakened at the root and principle. Sin's activity and actions are not fewer and weaker than formerly. And sin, they are now fewer and weaker than formerly. And sin is not able to hinder man's duty nor interrupt his peace. When man can quietly and in a calm frame of spirit search out and fight against sin and gain the victory against it and continue in the peace of God, then sin is mortified in some considerable measure. Thus, our victory of mortification will be realized to a large extent as we weaken lust's presence and enticements. We must implant, promote the continual residence of and cherish those graces that stand in direct opposition to lust. So, for example, by implanting and growing humility, pride is weakened. Passion is weakened by patience. Uncleanness by purity of mind and conscience. Love of this world is weakened by our heavenly mindedness, thinking about the things of heaven. These graces of the Spirit, as they are expressed in various ways, when we give ourselves to these practices, they weaken the perplexing lusts that wage war against us. Our victory will be further realized as the new man immediately springs to action and cheerfully fights against lust the moment it appears and doesn't give up fighting until you've sequestered that temptation and it no longer raises its ugly head. We must use every weapon available to conquer it. John Owen ends here by saying that these weapons will secure a great degree of success. If a particular sin does not have some unusual advantage as a result of its nature, then the victory gained may become a permanent conquest. The soul may thus arrive at a great degree of peace and conscience, according to the terms of the covenant of grace. What a great encouraging word to end on, that we really can, by the Spirit within us, actually conquer sin. We don't have to be overcome by and weakened and pestered by the constant attack of temptation. We can overcome it. Yes, he's already told us that we will be fighting sin for the rest of our lives until we get to glory, but we don't have to be overcome by sin. Temptation will always be there, but we can fight temptation and not have to give into it. Temptation is not the same thing as sin. There are many people who are often tempted. Jesus Christ himself was tempted in every way as we are, Hebrews tells us, yet he was without sin. So just being tempted does not mean that we give into the temptation. And so Owen is reminding us here that we can actually overcome it. We can we can be victorious over our temptations. What a great encouragement. The next chapter, chapter 7, is going to be an exposition of the fact that only believers, only Christians who have the Holy Spirit within them can mortify sin. So he's going to argue here that if you're not a Christian, you can never have victory over temptation, and you are still a slave to sin. Which means to say, if you want to fight sin, or better yet, which means to say, if you don't want sin to drag you to hell, you need to come back next week and see what it means to be a believer so that you can mortify the flesh. I pray that this has been a blessing to you on this Friday morning. Again, I appreciate you guys tuning in. You could be doing anything. You could be sleeping in. You could be playing with your kids or watching Friday morning cartoons, but here you are reading a 300-year-old book, a Puritan, on how to put to death sin. And I pray that God would honor that and bless you. And I will pray right now, even as we get off, that God would give us victory even today over our temptation and enable us to fight and to kill sin. All right. I'll see you guys next week, Lord willing.